this kind of dovetails a little bit into what I want to talk to Dr. Grimes about. And Jerry Grimes is a candidate for a PhD in religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's also senior pastor at Peter's Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church in Wallace, North Carolina. In addition to being a documentarian and an author, he is a renowned historian. He has preached from Los Angeles to Chicago to his home state of North Carolina. Dr. Grimes, thanks for joining me here on News Radio KDKA.
Thank you so much, Brother Lenny. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So let's deal with the question that Leah, again, I appreciate your phone call and thank you for dialing in. Happy holidays to you and yours. I would venture to say, and I'm going to throw this out to you initially, because again, you have a confluence of understanding religion and history and politics and American society based on your backgrounds. The answer to Lee's question when he says, well, what do you think they're going to be able to get away with? I would answer that question by saying they'll get away with as much as their base will support them for and as much as the American people will stomach. And based on who that support comes from, whether it's the religious right or just the cultural right or just the, seasonal MAGA voter, that will determine their leeway. What say you, sir?
I would say that with the aims of the Department of Government Efficiency, there is a valid need for concern with its actual goals versus the goals that it communicates. It is very easy to use the rhetoric of wanting to, quote unquote, make the government smaller, while at the same time, unfortunately, it's very easy to convince a particular part of the population or the population in general that either the miniaturizing or complete elimination of a government agency is going to be particularly helpful. Though Richard Nixon should rarely ever be the best example of anything with regards to his morality and how he, to use the words of Professor James Reston, how he left this nation in trauma upon leaving office, we should still consider the fact that the EPA began during the Nixon administration. Likewise, during the administration of FDR, many of the government agencies that have become really a part of the cornerstone of our government mechanism were developed out of need, out of a practical need during President Roosevelt's administration. And so when we began examining, and I think about an economist like Milton Friedman, who wanted to eliminate a number of government agencies. But what President Reagan wisely did was to, instead of seeking to even eliminate these agencies, any type of entity is going to have fiscal waste. It's going to have the need to be made more efficient. And so rather than saying we're going to eliminate the Department of Education, for instance, the real challenge is, can we have a Department of Education that's led by educators that empowers them to refine and to make more efficient the department for the types of professions that we're going to need increasingly that benefit first the American population, but then also the world's population. And I am not entirely sure. I have not seen any evidence, and I could easily be wrong, but I have neither heard nor seen any evidence that this new government department, which ironically, its purpose is to make the government smaller, but begins by making it larger by itself being a new department. Because again, these departments were developed for practical needs. There's a reason that we have a nuclear regulatory commission. There's a reason that we have a Department of Energy and so forth. But again, understandably, whenever people are more concerned, and rightfully so, with surviving day to day and taking care of their children and providing for themselves and being concerned at the end of the month that they're going to have enough money to get to the end of the month, when so many Americans have more month than they do money at the end of the month, then it becomes a far less concern with regards to how we streamline government agencies. So right now we're at an inconclusive point, but at least history, there are some positive precedents to show that you can have government efficiency while at the same time maintain the necessity of our government apparatus.
Dr. Grimes, let's jump into this a little bit because we're talking about the Republican Party right now. It's a party that you and I both are familiar with for years now, and there are people that are saying that despite Donald Trump's win, that it still has a very, I don't want to say cloistered. That's not the appropriate word, but it's more of a narrow view of how to deal with government, how to deal with the issues of a society that's 320 million plus, and still try to have its principles or what it's purporting intact and still work for more people. As we come into this point of time culturally, what's the significance? And you can be looking at this from a Christian right perspective because obviously the Christian right has influenced the political right a lot more over the last 30 to 40 years. What's the significance of saying this is how you view things culturally, and although you won elections, that still may or may not be effectively shoehorned into what bigger swaths of the society, and I'm not saying more people, but I'm saying, rural or suburban America is not facing the same type of issues that the bigger cities may be facing. Are we at a point of time where the two are going to be able to jibe, or is this just going to be more conflict? And if there's a way to make it jibe, how do we do that culturally when you're talking about something that seems to be more narrowly focused on principles or pockets of support than what we've had previously? And you can make the argument on the other side if you wanted to as well. I mean, you can make the argument about the liberals on the left as well.
So what I have been noticing here, and just examining North Carolina, for instance, election night was not a good night for the Republican Party in the state of North Carolina. Even now, there are several tensions as there was a Senate bill in the North Carolina General Assembly, which was basically designed to remove and through the override of the veto of Governor Roy Cooper, the Senate was able to remove executive power from the incoming Governor-elect Josh Stein.
Yep.
Before election night in North Carolina, there was a Republican lieutenant governor, a Republican superintendent of the State Department of Public Instruction. There was a veto-proof supermajority. As of January 2025, none of that will be true. And the western part of the state trended far more blue than anyone saw in any of the polls. In fact, it was the eastern part of the state where I live, east of Wake County, that trended red more heavily, yet both the west and the east are rural. What we're witnessing, and in terms of the ultimate shape and form and trajectory of this, what I'm calling an ideological civil war within the GOP, we're witnessing the beginning of that. You and I were very active in 2010 when we saw what I would consider metaphorically the overture to this ideological civil war. And that is republicanism traditionally, in different ways from 1854 to certainly 1984, thought to be a right of center party. Fiscally conservative, socially moderate, with the exception of the rise of the moral majority in the late 70s, and with the issue of reproductive rights becoming a means to which large parts of evangelical voter blocs would turn out for candidates within the Republican Party. But of course, President Reagan was a Democrat for a very long time before he became a Republican, and famously said that he did not leave the Democratic Party, it left him. The question is going to be for Republicans now who are non-MAGA Republicans, who even other members of the party would consider quote-unquote rhinos, Republicans in name only. The question is going to be who can reclaim the middle? Because if unaffiliated voters were a political party unto themselves, then that voting bloc and that political party would in fact be the most decisive political party within the country. And unfortunately, there's always been this tension with very few exceptions, from between 1776 to now, in which the government that serves us has rarely been worthy of the populace that it serves. And that when you ask me what will happen culturally, I have witnessed, both analytically and anecdotally, I have far more faith in the ability of communities and neighborhoods to find a common ground than I do in individuals who are a part of whether a state, but particularly on a federal level, government entities that at this point function like post-partisan corporations, meaning behind closed doors, deals are made in which if a general population has to suffer, whether it be in a particular region of the U.S. or whether it be in a particular state or county, then the easiest thing to do for those in power to remain in power is to turn individuals against one another. I've often said the problems of the trailer park and the problems of the housing project in the city are the same problems. And yet there are some individuals, not all, but there certainly are some individuals in power who know how to convince individuals who are both victims and who are both, unfortunately, disposed and predisposed to the same poor leadership to be convinced that they're one another's problem.
Dr. Grimes, Dr. Grimes, let me stop you there because I have to take a break, but I'm going to continue this line of thought and ask some additional questions. Again, I got Dr. Jerry Grimes on the line with me, 866-391-1020, coming back with him on News Radio KDKA. All right, 22 past the hour, getting back to the senior pastor at Peter's Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, Dr. Jerry Grimes. Dr. Grimes, we were talking about just where we may be with this. Let me ask you this question, because there's obviously been a shift. And part of the show that I was talking about earlier was the inability of people to lean back, take that breath, and make good life decisions, whether it's with a gun in their hand or political decisions, by taking that extra breath. What do we do? Whether it's the influences that are hitting us culturally, spiritually, politically, or otherwise, now that we're going into 2025, and you talked about the Civil War, how do we take that breath to start going back and, in essence, reclaiming the middle, regardless of what label you put on it politically? Because it seems as though the middle is exhausted, they're tired, and more often than not, they're forgotten about when it comes to these type of conversations about policy and implementation of policy.
Well, I absolutely agree with you with regards to the extent to which people not only feel forgotten about, but there is a reality in which it is clear that there are entire large parts of our population. As you mentioned, I've lived in the state of North Carolina and the Commonwealth of Virginia. I've lived in the Chicagoland area. I've lived in California. And I can assure you there are variations of those who feel either rejected or overlooked. There are variations regionally throughout the United States. So the beauty of our demography is the uniqueness of our experiences. And just a quick side note, I say this as a proud Green Bay Packers fan, but likewise, I also acknowledge that when we're discussing preeminent football dynasties, the Pittsburgh Steelers are the preeminent dynasty in professional football. And so
I was going to invite you back on the show regardless. You didn't need to say that, but it didn't hurt. Go ahead.
Well, it's easy to tell the truth. So I mean, certainly, when I think about great organizations, not only in sports but in general, I look at what the Rooney family has done and is doing in terms of the community and just the importance, as you talked about, culture and how do we get back to that. To a great degree, that's the importance of sports. That's the importance of finding those third spaces, whether it be our places of religious worship, but also because there can also be tensions there, but perhaps areas where we gather and acknowledge the fact that here are our disagreements. We put all of our disagreements out on the table first, and then from there we say, but there's a good chance we all agree that we want our children to flourish. There's a very good chance that we all want to be able to live both peacefully and peaceably with one another. And when we think about the reason, because we don't have a draft, so when our courageous service members join the armed forces, they're making that decision.
As volunteers.
Yes. They are choosing to uphold and defend the Constitution of this republic. And our founders knew that within their lifetime, they had ideals that they knew would not be fully realized in their lifetime. And this may sound somewhat overly idealistic, but I don't think it is overly idealistic to think that they were envisioning us being able to more greatly realize what they had envisioned as the world's first, which the United States is. It is the world's first post-Enlightenment republic. It is the first republic in the history of all of humankind that sought to put into work what does a bicameral government look like when the people have voice. Now, it was incredibly imperfect as compared to where we are now. For as much as we complain now, I think we forget only the landed gentry could initially vote in the early national period. And so we're still in the act of refining and improving, augmenting, fully realizing what they envisioned. But this is the metaphor that I use, and to really answer your question
very quickly. Or how about I do this, Dr. Grimes? Can you hang on to that metaphor, and then we can take it after the news break?
Absolutely.
You hang on to that metaphor because I want you to be able to flesh that out even more. I'm going to riff off of that with you. I'm talking to Dr. Jerry Grimes, and we're talking about the confluence of religion and politics and culture, and what can we do to move past these tensions that we've had in 2024, that we've had over the last several years, over the last several decades, and how do we be a more perfect union starting in 2025? We'll talk about that after the news here on News Radio KDKA. All right, 35 past the hour. If you're listening to us on 100.1 FM or AM 1020 here in Pittsburgh, it is 8:35. If you're listening to us on the Odyssey app, it is 35 past the hour, regardless of where you are in the world. And I am talking to Dr. Jerry Grimes, and I appreciate this good man and my brother who I've known for 15 years joining me as we're kind of digging through some of these issues. And Dr. Grimes, the reason why I have you on the line talking about some of these things is because you get how so many of these things are cross-sections together. Now, I've made cross-section both a noun, a verb, and an adverb over the course of the show, so give me grace on my grammar. But that said, you understand how these things all come together, and they're different levers that dictate how Americans vote, but more importantly, how they act, and as a result, how it's gotten us here. So I guess the next question is, because you talked about the Civil War, and I'm going to say yes, it's a civil war within the Republican Party, or what's called the Republican Party right now, but it's also a civil war within the body politic of America, because we have to decide who we want to be moving forward. And I throw this premise out there to you. First of all, I'll throw the premise out there after your metaphor. I asked you to hold on to a metaphor. Please start with the metaphor, and I'll get to what I want to throw to you after that.
Oh, absolutely. So there was a film that was released 4 years ago entitled Judas and the Black Messiah. And it was a biopic that focused on about 1 year in the life, the final year in the life of Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party.
Yes.
So this is during the aftermath of the tragic assassination of Dr. King. And there's a scene in the film where Fred Hampton takes a few members of his political party to meet members of a predominantly white political party. And they meet inside of a building in which there's a Confederate flag on the wall. There's immediate tension, but then Fred Hampton poses a question. He says, you fly one flag and I fly another flag. But if this building were on fire right now, what would our culture be? Water and escape. You were raised in one way, I was raised differently. You believe one thing, I believe something else. But if this building were on fire right now, what would our culture be? Water and escape. You say you're fighting for one culture. I say I'm fighting for another. But what will our culture be if this building is burning up right now? Water and escape. I say that, Brother Lenny, because December 19th, 1982, my family's home, my childhood home in 1982, burned. We lived in what was called a shotgun house, which was a very small structure, and it was heated with what's called a potbelly stove. That's what we called it. But in a mere matter of minutes, the house burned. And there came a moment in which we realized that we could not stop the blaze. There was nothing that would happen. We also had a real Christmas tree. And one of my most stark and vivid memories as a 5-year-old was watching how quickly that tree simply just went up in flames. The only thing that survived the fire was a portrait of my grandfather, which still was damaged. But we held on to that because he said to us before he had passed in 1977 that he would always be with us. And we always took that as a sign that he's always with us. But in that moment, all we cared about, there reached a moment where there was nothing else we could do except to realize we can always get another house, we can start over, but as a family, we have to run. America is a family. What has happened, though, is there's a plutocratic structure. And what I mean by that, a plutocracy is when a small number of people are able to exert an incredible amount of control over a large group of people, typically to the point of turning those people against one another. And there have been times economically, there have been times emotionally, socially, and otherwise, where the house is on fire. And there are individuals who've been convinced to be angry at one another when they don't realize they need one another because the culture is water and escape. When we see what happened in South Korea just earlier this week, we saw in South Korea what should have happened here 4 years ago, that the resiliency of the American people, who we are, who our forebearers have been, what they endured so that we have a republic, says to us that when it's all said and done, the government exists because we allow it, not the other way around. And there has to come a point, and I don't know who it's going to be because that person hasn't emerged. It's going to be some JFK/Reagan-esque figure. It's going to be a movement that captures the fact that there has to be clarity. I think whenever people hear me praise Reagan, I think they overlook the fact that Obama himself often praised Reagan. In 2008, he did, and it damaged him in the Nevada caucus because he said that Reagan brought a sense of dynamism and optimism and entrepreneurship that America had been missing. And the aftermath of this past election says to me, yes, many people spoke clearly one way or the other, but what currently exists, there's an unfortunate vacuity of a sense of what it means to be an American and what that's going to be and what that has to be. When I look at my daughter's generation, my daughter's 5 years old, I look to her generation with hope, that we leave enough of a social structure and make enough strides in the interim until her generation brings about a type of clarity. So to really answer your question, to wrap up that metaphor, when people are struggling, when they are understandably terrified, and when I say people, I include myself in that. Whenever you may remember, when I ran for Congress, I ran on the fact that I was driving a Camry with 394,000 miles, and I had no health insurance. But I was running because I wanted there to be a voice of people who were driving cars that had almost 400,000 miles and had no health insurance, while the net worth of individuals who are elected continue to go up.
So let me ask this question again, talking to Dr. Jerry Grimes, who is the senior pastor at Peter's Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church in Wallace, North Carolina. It's also has one PhD and is a candidate for another PhD in the religious studies program at the prestigious University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is also an author that has preached literally from coast to coast. What does it take, Dr. Grimes, to move us away from this dynamic where the whole struggle for America's soul has always been you have a democracy, but it's built on compromise. But people have constantly been yanking us in this tug of war between folks wanting to conquer the other, quote unquote, people within America versus there being a system of compromise between the two peoples of America, politically speaking. Conquering, the mindset of conquering the other, the political foe, and quote unquote vanquishing them, the enemy within, that mindset has taken over much more than the I need to compromise with them even if I have the upper hand and even if I'm the majority. How do we move away from the conquering mindset back to the compromise mindset that the founders built this system on?
There has to be a very conscious effort to make fashionable and to make admirable doing the right thing and being a good person. And as simplistic as this might sound, and as tragic as this may sound, to a great degree, it has become far less admirable and far less fashionable to do what's most mature. I was listening to the caller, the gentleman who called earlier, and he talked about the restraint that he was able to exercise in a situation in which the climate and the tension within our postmodern culture has emerged, in which there are too few individuals who are able to exercise the kind of restraint, the kind of maturity, the type of clarity that that gentleman was able to exercise. And there's no one right answer in terms of how that's addressed. I hear many people say, well, it starts at home. But I think there's often the presumption that all homes are healthy homes. Many times there are homes in which there have been legacies of trauma in which there has to be a series of systems of help. And this is where congregational bodies, whether churches or whether members of other faith communities are able to partner with families, are able to partner with a local government, are able to partner with local leaders. And there has to be an agreement, first in understanding that nothing is going to be perfect, but we're striving for a tolerable harmony. And then with the agreement that there are basic things that are absolutely necessary for people to be able to live together.
Now it's interesting that you use the word harmony. I'm gonna throw this in there, then I'm gonna go to break and come back to you as we finish up the hour. Harmony implies two things. One, there's two different lines of music that are not the same line of music. They're made to come together and still be music, even being in many ways much different in tone. They may even be different in the pace in which it's sung or played, but because it's in harmony, it's still music. And I think people miss that. They're more inclined, and plus it's done in a way where they're complementary to each other, even if one is louder than the other at one point in time or the another. And I kind of want to riff off that in just a little bit, because you brought up harmony, and we haven't had a lot of that politically in quite some time. And people seem to think that we'll get more stuff done because one party has all the levers of government at the federal level, but it's still a system that has the 10th Amendment, which means that you're going to be dealing with some states that have the trifecta on the other side. I'm going to finish up with my good friend, Dr. Jerry Grimes. Phone lines are open, 866-391-1020. We're kind of riffing on the how to dig through this cultural muck politically to get to that more perfect union. Finishing up this hour here on News Radio KDKA. PhD student at the University of Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, religious studies, but he is so much more than that. Historian, politician, reverend. Dr. Grimes, I talked about the whole aspect of harmony and compromise and working through a system where we were supposed to be forced to do that together, and yet has not been the case for a while now. And it seems as though the rules have changed and people are less looking to do that. Again, we kept talking about Reagan. I brought up Reagan before you came on the show, and everybody always talks about Tip O'Neill and Reagan. They talk about other instances. I mean, you can go to the 1990s and talk about Clinton and Newt Gingrich, where there was this back and forth and working together in certain instances where different branches of government made something happen. What is it going to take to get that dynamic back in place?
I think one helpful thing that has to happen, and this has to start very early, and it may vary from state to state, but I began taking civics in the 7th grade, and there was some variation of civics that I took into the 10th grade. And then of my own volition, I continued to study government and to study policy. Whenever there is a lack of familiarity, when there's an absence of knowledge of why, for instance, the 10th Amendment is so critical, of understanding why there is a 25th Amendment. So, for instance, even with the outgoing vice president, on November 19th, 2021, she already had assumed executive power for 2 hours and 7 minutes. But because the importance and the brilliance of our Constitution has increasingly been so minimized, with exceptions, of course, then there is, we've reached a point in which there are more and more leaders who don't see the value in fostering that type of relationship that Reagan and O'Neill, that Clinton and Newt Gingrich, that to a varying degree Obama and John Boehner were able to have. And so then what happens, and we know this going through primaries ourselves, the primary season unfortunately pushes candidates so far into one extreme or another that instead of focusing on what's most important, which is how can our republic flourish to the benefit of its citizens and the residents of the constituent states, and then to members of our global community, what becomes most important then is who is able to get the most votes, the most power, the most control. The only way this shifts that I foresee, and Jeffersonian brilliance is something that always really gives me a sense of encouragement, is that about every 20 years, there has to come such a significant tectonic political shift that changes the landscape, that anyone who's seeking office understands that it will not be acceptable to speak to large groups of people and describe them in disparaging terms. And I'm happy to say for many of the more extreme candidates who won their primaries during this last election cycle, many of them did not fare as well in the general election. And that does at least speak to and gives us reason to have hope that there are individuals who are at least seeking who cares about what is in the best interest of residents, of individual counties and townships and states, who cares about people. And as simple as that sounds, and I know coming from a pastor, imagine me saying that, and even I can be sardonic in my own ways from the pulpit with my critique, but that's also a part of the American tradition. Whether Hamilton and Adams and Jefferson, they all kind of took turns with their barbs against one another.
Yes, they
but
did.
There was also this concern for the betterment of the republic.
Dr. Grimes, before I let you go, I got 30 seconds. Where can people find your work online?
So I pastor Peter's Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church. Our YouTube would be youtube.com, Peter's Tabernacle 1870. Also, I have a website, jerrygrimes.com, but that's currently under construction. So for the most part, I have speeches on YouTube, and my email address would be jgrimes@unc.edu, where I am privileged to attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is the Michael Jordan of universities. And if I may say with
very
5
quickly,
seconds,
very quickly.
I just wanted to give my prayers out from what I've heard that Miss Elizabeth Pollard, who has not yet been found. I just wanted to offer prayers for her family, for the Unity Township, and just for the greater Commonwealth and the community right now in light of that. And to thank you for this opportunity to appear here on KDKA.
Dr. Grimes and Reverend Grimes, I appreciate you not only offering those prayers for her family, but thank you for joining me this evening on News Radio KDKA, kind sir.
Thank you so much.